I didn't learn my little sister was getting married from a phone call or a save the date. I learned the way strangers learn, from a tagged photo on our aunt's Instagram. Lydia stood under twinkling lights in a white gown, our mother's hand clasped in hers like a blessing, while the rest of my family smiled as if my name had never belonged to them. There was a string quartet, flowers arranged like someone had cared enough to make everything perfect, and a caption that made my stomach turn with its easy certainty about family. I stared at that image until the screen dimmed, then tapped it awake again, as if looking longer could change what it meant. I wasn't on the guest list, not in print, not in pencil, not even as an afterthought. It would have hurt less if I hadn't spent years being the person who held Lydia together. I paid her tuition when the loans didn't stretch far enough. I drove her to class when she couldn't breathe through her anxiety. I skipped interviews and rearranged my life around her emergencies because I believed love was proven by what you were willing to sacrifice. Somehow, on her biggest day, I wasn't even a shadow in the room. No one called, no one checked if I was okay. The silence didn't feel accidental. It felt curated. The truth was, I'd been trained for that kind of erasure early. I was 10 the first time I noticed my mother could look through me instead of at me. It was a Sunday morning in Plano, Texas, when Lydia had a fever and our mother hovered over her with a cold compress and soft concern. I stood in the kitchen doorway, holding a drawing I'd worked on all night for a school art contest, charcoal smudged on my fingers, a tear in my shirt from leaning too long over the desk. I waited for her eyes to lift, for her face to register me, for anything that said I mattered too. She never looked up. She only asked me to make ginger tea for my sister, like that was my place in the room. After that, it was always small things that added up to a life. Lydia's ballet recitals got bouquets and family dinners, while my debate trophies collected dust. My father was present in the way furniture is present, fixing the sink, watching the Weather Channel, taking us to breakfast once a month, never stepping between my mother's decisions and my quiet acceptance. When she said Lydia was delicate and I was strong, he nodded and turned the page, as if strength was a reason to receive less. By high school, I stopped asking for anything. I learned to fill out my own forms, chase my own scholarships, and keep my pride tidy. I got a part-time job at the library and still made sure Lydia had help with her essays. Once, she texted me from the back seat of someone's car, party noise behind her, saying she'd forgotten a deadline. I stayed up until 3 a.m. finishing her application so she wouldn't lose her chance. She got in. I went to Duke. My parents visited her campus multiple times. They came to my graduation once, late, with a card that held $20 like an afterthought. I smiled anyway. I became the kind of person who could swallow disappointment without making a sound. After college, I moved to Los Angeles and built a career in investment strategy, the kind that demanded long hours and sharper edges. I climbed fast. I earned well. I bought my own place. I kept sending money home when it was needed, covering medical copays, paying a bill still tangled in my name, flying in for holidays with wine and gifts, while feeling like a guest in my own bloodline. I kept showing up, because somewhere inside me was still the old belief that if I was steady enough, if I was generous enough, if I never made trouble, I'd finally be chosen. Then came my 30th birthday. I booked a small Italian place in West Hollywood and reserved a table for 3 at 6:30 p.m. I called my parents a week in advance. My mother sounded distracted, said they'd see how they felt. They never arrived. At 6:45 p.m., I was still holding a menu I wasn't reading, pretending I didn't notice the waiter glancing at the empty seats. I texted. No reply. Later, I opened Instagram and saw Lydia laughing at a vineyard with our parents. The caption read like a knife. Weekend with the fam. That wasn't the moment that broke me. It was the moment that made everything finally make sense. It wasn't forgetting. It was a pattern. So when I saw Lydia's bridal boutique photos, champagne, friends I didn't know, my mother beside her like a proud co-star, and realized no one had told me, my first instinct was to ask why. I texted my mother anyway, because old habits cling. No answer. I texted again. The typing bubbles appeared, then vanished. And something in me went strangely calm, like a door closing without a slam. That night, my best friend Alyssa met me for drinks and didn't sugarcoat it. She didn't treat it like a misunderstanding. She called it what it was, surgical. She said Lydia was marrying into money, into a family that would rather present a clean story than a complicated truth. I didn't argue, because it fit too well. Somewhere between the clink of glasses and the low hum of the bar, I stopped thinking about how to get back in and started thinking about what it would feel like to walk away without begging. I went home, opened my calendar, and looked at the life I'd built around proving I could endure. Then I looked at Nolan's trip to New York, a business week he'd invited me to join. Before, I'd told him, maybe. Now the word landed differently. Maybe wasn't uncertainty anymore. Maybe was a doorway. When I told Nolan I was coming, he didn't ask for explanations. He just smiled like he'd been waiting for me to choose myself. In New York, beneath the quiet luxury of a hotel suite and the restless city lights, I finally said the words out loud. My sister is getting married in July, and I found out from Instagram. I expected pity or anger on my behalf. Instead, Nolan gave me something steadier. He told me I wasn't disposable. He told me I didn't have to keep contorting myself for people committed to misunderstanding my worth. And in that calm, without a ring or a staged moment, he offered me a different kind of life. One where being seen wasn't something I had to earn. I said yes to him before I even realized I was also saying no to everything that had trained me to disappear. When we flew back to Los Angeles, the city looked the same. Sunlight on concrete, palms cutting into the sky, traffic humming like a permanent soundtrack. But I didn't fit inside my old rhythm anymore. On Monday morning, I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and stared at numbers that used to excite me. Forecasts, decks, approvals, messages from analysts asking for quick decisions. I moved my cursor like I was trying to remember how to be the woman who never let anything slip. Then I stopped pretending. I opened a blank email and wrote a leave of absence notice. Not as a request, but as a statement. Effective immediately. No return date, no explanation I couldn't live without. I hit send and felt something unclench in my chest, like I'd been holding my breath for years without realizing it. That evening, Nolan walked into the kitchen while I reheated leftover pasta, and he told me to pack light. When I asked why, he turned his phone toward me. A confirmation, a map, a sweep of blue sea around white rooftops. Santorini. He said I needed air and sunlight and distance, and I didn't argue. I had been trained to justify every need, to explain why I deserved rest. But he didn't ask me to defend myself. He just made space for me to step into something softer. Alyssa squealed when I told her and showed up the next day with a dress bag like she'd been waiting for this moment. Inside was a red silk dress that looked like it had been cut from confidence itself, bold and unapologetic. She told me it wasn't a trip for neutrals, and for once, I listened. I was tired of being beige for other people's comfort. We left on a Friday and landed on the island like stepping into a held breath. Santorini was bluer than photographs, wider and brighter, the kind of beauty that felt unfair. Our villa perched above the sea in Ia, white walls and cobalt shutters, an infinity pool that made the horizon look close enough to touch. The first morning, I woke before Nolan and drank coffee barefoot on the terrace, watching the sky shift from pearl to gold. I didn't feel like I was escaping anymore. I felt like I was arriving. On the second night, I wore the red dress. No heavy makeup, just gold hoops and sun-warmed skin. Nolan looked at me like he was seeing the whole story at once, every version of me that had ever been asked to shrink, and the version that finally refused. He didn't compliment the dress as much as what it symbolized. It felt like closure and beginning stitched into the same fabric. A few days later, Nolan arranged a boat. Nothing gaudy, just perfect. Clean lines, teak deck, a local captain with a quiet smile. We slipped away from the dock and cut across the Aegean with the wind wrapping around us like permission. I stood at the bow, holding the rail, hair tangled, the red silk moving against the pale blue water like a flag. Nolan took a photo without making a ceremony of it. When he showed me the screen, I barely recognized the woman staring back. She didn't look like someone waiting for approval. She looked like someone who had finally remembered her own name. He told me to post it, gently, as if offering me a choice instead of a dare. I hesitated because part of me still believed visibility was dangerous. But another part of me, newer, steadier, was tired of living like a secret. I opened Instagram and typed the caption that had been forming in my throat since the day I saw Lydia's wedding photo. Not all families are worth RSVPing for. Then I hit share and closed the app before I could overthink it. I didn't expect what happened next. Notifications exploded. Likes and comments multiplied faster than I could track. People I hadn't spoken to in years resurfaced with messages that read like confessions. "I didn't know. I'm so sorry. You look incredible. You deserve peace." The tone wasn't pity. It was recognition, like they were watching someone step out of a shadow and didn't know where to place their awe. The photo traveled in ways I couldn't have predicted. Someone screenshotted it into a private Facebook group. From there, it hopped across acquaintances and bridal circles until it landed in the orbit of people I'd never met, but whose names carried weight. One profile caught my eye: Harper Whitford. The last name struck like a bell. Whitford Hospitality, Joanna Whitford's niece. And there, in a thread, Harper had tagged Joanna with a line that made my stomach go cold. "Thought you'd want to see this. Heard some interesting things about the Quinn girl." Nolan read it and said nothing dramatic, just one quiet sentence that felt like a shift in weather. It begins. Back in Texas, Joanna Whitford didn't like surprises. In her world, surprises cost control, and control was the currency that protected legacies. She saw the caption, read it more than once, and instead of calling Lydia, she called her assistant. By the end of the day, Joanna had a folder on her desk thick with records. My education, my work, every public mention, every verifiable achievement. Then Lydia's file beside it, thinner, fuzzier at the edges. Joanna noticed what didn't match, claims that didn't line up with transcripts, a school that wasn't on any credible record, a resume polished just enough to pass at a glance, but sloppy under inspection. The problem wasn't that Lydia wanted to look impressive. The problem was that she lied to people who built empires on vetting every detail. Joanna pulled old onboarding files, found a message Lydia had sent to HR years ago, and saw the story Lydia had been selling. A fabricated academic history and invented credentials dressed up to look like legacy. Joanna didn't get angry the way people without power get angry. She got precise. And the next evening, she called her son, Thomas, and asked him what he really knew about the woman he was about to marry. Thomas didn't have answers. He had Lydia's version of the truth, which was mostly a narrative. Complicated family, distant sister, nothing worth discussing. Joanna handed him the evidence and watched his face change as he realized the foundation beneath his wedding plans wasn't solid. Joanna didn't tell him what to do. She didn't need to. She only reminded him that marriage wasn't a ceremony. It was an attachment. And attachments had consequences. Meanwhile, I woke in Santorini to sunlight and a phone full of messages. Cousins, old classmates, even someone from Lydia's orbit. The most unsettling message came from a mutual contact who wrote that Lydia was unraveling, and I didn't understand what I'd started. I set the phone down and took a slow sip of coffee, listening to the sea breathe beyond the terrace. It wasn't me unraveling this time. It was the image my family had stitched together for years, the one where Lydia was the shining center and I was the invisible scaffolding holding her up. By the time we returned to the villa that afternoon, more whispers had reached Texas, and 3 weeks before Lydia's wedding, her perfect day began to fold in on itself, not with a scream, but with the kind of quiet decision that only people with money can make. In a venue near Nashville, planners were arranging centerpieces beneath chandeliers when Joanna Whitford arrived at 8 a.m., wearing a navy suit and the calm expression of someone signing off on a merger. She didn't ask for coffee, she didn't debate. She looked at the team and told them to shut it down. Reception canceled, funding withdrawn. Ceremony scaled back to immediate family only. No dinner, no music, no spectacle. Lydia learned it in her bridal suite, with makeup half done and her phone buzzing nonstop. She stared at her reflection like it had betrayed her, as if staring hard enough could reverse what was happening. She called my mother in panic and rage, and my mother's voice came out brittle, explaining what she couldn't fix. Lydia blamed me because it was easier than facing the truth. She'd built her whole wedding on a story that depended on my silence, and silence was no longer something she could command. That night, as Santorini wind moved softly through our open window, my phone rang. Lydia's name lit the screen. I answered and let the silence sit first, not to punish her, but because I was done rushing to fill spaces she created. When she finally spoke, her voice was uneven, sharp with fear, asking why I'd done this, accusing me of turning her wedding into my stage. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself the way I used to. I told her the simplest truth. She didn't invite me. She erased me. And now she was angry that people could finally see what she tried to hide. I told her she wasn't humiliated because I posted a photo. She was humiliated because her lies couldn't hold their shape anymore. She cried and tried to call it betrayal, as if my living was violence. I listened, calm as stone, and for the first time, I didn't volunteer to fix anything. When she asked what happened next, I told her I wasn't the one who needed to repair it. And when she demanded to know if I hated her, I surprised myself by answering honestly. I didn't. I didn't hate her. I felt nothing. Not because I was cruel, but because the part of me that used to bleed for her had finally gone quiet. When the call ended, I didn't cry. I didn't throw my phone. I just sat in the dark with the wind brushing my skin like a blessing. And I understood something I'd never fully believed before. Freedom doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives as a calm, clean emptiness where guilt used to live. When the wedding day arrived back in Tennessee, it unfolded without the grandeur Lydia had spent months rehearsing. The chandeliers still hung, the chapel still stood, but the room felt hollowed out, like a stage after the audience has left. Only a small circle of relatives sat in the pews, their whispers louder than any music. There were no florals framing the aisle, no dinner waiting beyond the ceremony, no photographer choreographing moments for later admiration. Lydia walked forward in a dress that suddenly felt heavier than silk, her smile practiced but brittle, her eyes searching the room for reassurance that never quite arrived. Thomas stood at the altar, quiet, composed, and distant in a way she had never seen before. The vows were said, the rings were exchanged, and when it ended cleanly, without applause, without celebration, without the sense of triumph she had imagined would crown her. 300 miles away, I sat at a small cafe in Ia with a cappuccino cooling beside me, unaware of the exact moment Lydia's carefully built world folded in on itself. I wasn't watching for updates. I wasn't waiting for a call. The day had a softness to it, the kind of afternoon where the light seems filtered through honey. Nolan had gone to pick up ferry tickets for a day trip, and I was scrolling absently when a notification slid across my screen. A digital magazine had published its summer edition. I clicked without thinking, then froze. There it was. The photo from the boat. The red dress. My back to the camera, the sea wide and unafraid behind me. The headline wasn't about me directly, but my name sat in the credits, quiet and undeniable. It felt surreal, not because I wanted recognition, but because that image had traveled farther than I ever had in my family. It had crossed borders, algorithms, and dinner tables I was never invited to. I didn't share it. I didn't comment. I just sat there and let the realization settle. Visibility has a way of revealing what silence once protected. Back in the chapel, whispers rippled through the remaining guests. Someone mentioned the article. Someone else mentioned the sister who wasn't there. The question wasn't where I was, it was why. And that question followed Lydia like a shadow she could no longer outrun. After the ceremony, Thomas didn't linger for photos. He didn't offer speeches or promises to smooth things over. When Lydia confronted him later, asking why he hadn't defended her, he told her something she had never heard from anyone before. He was tired of defending things that didn't hold up. That night, Lydia sat alone in her wedding dress while notifications stacked up on her phone. Messages from friends, acquaintances, distant relatives. Some were confused. Some were curious. None of them felt safe. Every screen held a reminder that the version of herself she had presented to the world was unraveling thread by thread. And in the middle of that unraveling, my image kept resurfacing, paired with captions about reinvention and quiet strength, about women who refused to disappear when written out of other people's stories. It wasn't cruelty that undid her. It was contrast. Just past midnight in Santorini, my phone rang again. Lydia's name glowed in the dark. I answered without ceremony and let the silence speak first. When she asked why I had done this, her voice cracked with exhaustion more than anger. She accused me of knowing what would happen, of lighting a fire and walking away. I told her I hadn't planned a collapse. I had planned a life. And if that life cast a shadow over hers, it was only because she had built her happiness on my absence. She told me the reception had been canceled, that guests had left early, that nothing looked the way it was supposed to. I listened, steady, and said the words that finally drew a line neither of us could pretend wasn't there. I didn't ruin her day. I refused to stay invisible so she could shine without consequence. I told her she wasn't angry because I lived loudly, but because the lie she told about our family couldn't survive the truth standing quietly beside it. When she asked what I felt toward her now, I searched myself carefully and answered with honesty instead of habit. I didn't hate her. I felt nothing. Not numbness, not bitterness, just a clean absence where obligation used to live. And that, more than anger, seemed to frighten her. The call ended without resolution, without apology, without a promise to try again. I slept anyway, the sound of waves folding into the night like a benediction. When we returned to Los Angeles, the city welcomed me back without ceremony. I unpacked slowly, not because I was reluctant, but because I wasn't in a hurry anymore. The red dress went into the back of the closet, folded carefully, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Within a week, I signed a lease on a small office in Culver City. Clean walls, wide windows, a desk that felt like a beginning. I named it Quinn Strategies and took my time choosing clients. Women who had been overlooked. Women who had been told to wait their turn. Women who were done waiting. The work felt different when I wasn't trying to prove my worth through exhaustion. Word spread quietly. The article helped, but it wasn't the image people stayed for. It was the steadiness, the sense that I wasn't performing anymore. At an event downtown, a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper handshake asked me if I was the face from the photo or something more substantial. I told her I was just me. She smiled and offered me a contract 2 days later. Then came the email I didn't expect. A meeting request from Joanna Whitford. No apology, no explanation, just an opening. I didn't respond right away. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel pressured to be gracious on someone else's timeline. When I did reply, I kept it simple and chose a time that worked for me. The day she walked into my office, she didn't try to dominate the space. She observed it. She told me she hadn't come to apologize, but to understand. She said the world had labeled my image as grace redefined, but she disagreed. She called it grace reclaimed. And in that moment, I realized something essential. Some people don't change because they're confronted. They change because they're forced to see clearly. When she left, the office returned to its quiet, and I felt no rush to analyze every word. I wasn't waiting for approval anymore, not from her, not from anyone. That night, a message from Lydia arrived with a photo attached, a newborn, tiny and wrapped in hospital linens. A question followed, tentative and unpolished, asking if I wanted to meet my niece. I stared at the screen for a long time, feeling the old pull of responsibility, then recognizing it for what it was, a habit, not a calling. I didn't respond. I didn't delete it right away either. I just let it sit, like an unanswered door I was no longer obligated to open. The next morning arrived quietly, the kind of quiet that no longer felt like punishment. Sunlight slid through the windows of my Silver Lake apartment, soft and uninsistent, and the smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen where Nolan had already started the day. He'd left a note on the counter before heading to an early meeting, telling me he loved me and adding, almost as an afterthought, that I'd been amazing. I smiled at the simplicity of it. No drama, no conditions, just presence. At the office, my inbox was fuller than it had ever been, but the tone was different. Women wrote to me from places I'd never been, Ohio, Vermont, Alaska, telling me they'd read my blog post about dignity and silence and felt seen for the first time. Some said they had been erased by families, others by workplaces or marriages, but the thread was the same. They had been taught to disappear quietly and were only now learning they didn't have to. I read every message slowly, not because I felt responsible for them, but because I respected the courage it took to send them. I hadn't written for applause, but knowing my words had landed somewhere tender felt like confirmation that leaving wasn't the end of the story. It was the start of a different one. That afternoon, I opened the old leather box I'd kept tucked in the back of my closet for years. Inside were remnants of a life I'd outgrown. Childhood photos, folded notes from Lydia, written in looping teenage handwriting. A small silver ring that had once belonged to our grandmother. I held the ring between my fingers, remembering how it had passed from hand to hand without ceremony, how it had eventually come back to me in a plain envelope after the funeral. It was light in my palm, but heavy with expectation. I put it back in the box and closed the lid gently. Not everything needed to be carried forward. Later, I walked to the neighborhood bookstore, the one Nolan and I used to visit on lazy weekends. The clerk recognized me, mentioning the article and how it had helped her accept distance from her own mother. I told her something I'd only recently learned myself. Surviving people you love doesn't make you cruel. It makes you honest. Saying it out loud felt like sealing a truth I'd been circling for years. That evening, the message from Lydia was still there. The photo of her baby hadn't changed. The question remained unanswered. I studied the tiny face on my screen, felt a flicker of something that might once have turned into guilt, and let it pass. The child was innocent, and so was I once. But innocence didn't require self-erasure as proof of love. I deleted the message, not in anger, not in defiance, but with the quiet certainty that some endings must be chosen by the person who was never given the power to begin. The following weeks moved with purpose. I launched the first phase of the Women Forward mentorship program, pairing founders with advisors who didn't mistake silence for weakness. Applications flooded in, each one a reminder that strength often develops in the absence of recognition. For the first time, I wasn't carrying someone else's future at the expense of my own. I was building something that didn't require me to disappear to function. Joanna Whitford reached out again, this time with an offer rather than an inquiry. She wanted me to lead a national initiative, to design and direct it with full authority. I hesitated only long enough to ask myself whether stepping into that space would shrink me or expand me. Nolan, as always, cut through the noise. He reminded me that gravity had shifted. I wasn't orbiting anyone else's expectations anymore. People could orbit me or not at all. I accepted. The announcement came quietly, without spectacle. There were no speeches about reconciliation, no public reckoning. Lydia would find out when everyone else did. I didn't owe her advance notice. I owed myself clarity. When the news went live, my phone buzzed with congratulations, not because I had finally been included, but because I had become undeniable. One night, after Nolan had fallen asleep beside me, I lay awake, listening to the city breathe. Cars passed, neighbors laughed somewhere down the street, life unfolding without my permission or resistance. I thought about the girl I'd been, the one who believed love was something you earned by being useful and quiet. I wished I could reach back through time and tell her the truth, that being strong doesn't mean enduring neglect, and being kind doesn't mean accepting erasure. By morning, the rain had come and gone, leaving the air rinsed and clear. I made my coffee slowly and stood by the window, watching the city begin again. There were no new messages from my family. The silence no longer asked me to fill it. It simply existed, and I let it. I didn't get everything I once wanted. I didn't get a family that learned how to see me. But I got something better. I got a life that no longer depended on their vision. And in choosing that, I learned the lesson that had taken me decades to understand. When someone tries to write you out of their story, it isn't an ending. It's an invitation, one you can finally accept on your own terms. The months that followed didn't arrive with fireworks or dramatic confrontations. They arrived with workdays that felt aligned instead of draining, with conversations that didn't require me to translate myself, with mornings where I woke up without bracing for disappointment. Quinn's strategies grew steadily, not because I chased visibility, but because women recognized themselves in the calm way I listened. They came in guarded and left lighter, as if being taken seriously without being tested was a new language they were learning to speak. The Women Forward initiative expanded faster than anyone expected. Mentors signed on who had once been sidelined themselves. Founders who had been told they were too much or not enough began to build with confidence instead of apology. I watched them step into rooms they'd been warned about and claim space without shrinking. Every success felt like a quiet correction, not just for them, but for every version of me that had been told strength meant silence. I heard about Lydia only in fragments, through a cousin's passing comment, through a friend of a friend who mentioned she and Thomas were working through things. I didn't ask questions. Curiosity had lost its grip on me. What surprised me wasn't the distance, but how natural it felt. For so long, separation had been framed as cruelty. Now it felt like neutrality, like choosing not to touch a hot surface again and calling it wisdom instead of resentment. One evening, Joanna Whitford invited me to speak at a closed-door session with a group of young executives. She introduced me without embellishment, listing my work rather than my story. Afterward, she pulled me aside and said something I hadn't expected. She told me she respected the way I didn't ask to be rescued. I understood then that power recognizes power, not through noise, but through restraint. That conversation didn't heal the past, but it confirmed the present. I was no longer a footnote in someone else's narrative. At home, life settled into something resembling peace. Nolan and I didn't rush toward milestones. We let them come when they made sense. Evenings were spent cooking together, windows open, music low, the city humming outside, like a reminder that life continues whether or not you perform for it. Love, I learned, didn't demand constant proof. It didn't keep score. It showed up and stayed. Sometimes I thought about the little girl I used to be, standing in a doorway with a drawing no one looked up to see. I imagined telling her that one day being overlooked would become the very skill that taught her how to see others clearly, that surviving invisibility would sharpen her sense of truth, that she would learn the difference between belonging and attachment, between loyalty and self-erasure. I didn't forgive my family in the traditional sense. I didn't sit them down or clear the air or rewrite history to make it gentler. Forgiveness, for me, became something quieter. It meant releasing the expectation that they would ever understand what they took. It meant not needing them to validate what I already knew. It meant allowing the story to end where it needed to, without dragging its weight into the chapters that followed. One afternoon, while reviewing applications for the next mentorship cohort, I paused over a line someone had written. I've spent my whole life trying to earn a seat at tables that never set a place for me. I sat back and smiled because I recognized the voice, not as it was, but as it was becoming. I wrote back personally, telling her something I wished someone had told me sooner. Sometimes the table isn't missing a seat. Sometimes it's just the wrong room. That truth stayed with me. I carried it into meetings, into friendships, into every decision that once would have required approval I no longer sought. I didn't need to be invited to feel legitimate. I didn't need to be remembered by people who only noticed me when I was useful. I had built a life where my presence wasn't conditional. Looking back, I realized the turning point hadn't been the photo, or the article, or even the wedding that unraveled without me. The turning point was the moment I stopped waiting to be chosen. The moment I understood that being left out didn't mean I was lacking. It meant I was free to choose differently. If there's one lesson I carry forward, it's this. Silence can be a wound, but it can also be a doorway. When people erase you, they don't get to define what comes next. You do. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't to demand a place where you are excluded, but to walk away and build something that doesn't require permission to exist. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt overlooked, written out, or quietly dismissed by people who were supposed to see you, know this: you're not alone, and you're not wrong for choosing yourself. If you found value here, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need it, subscribe for more stories about quiet strength and rebuilding, and comment below with your own experience. Your voice matters, and someone out there may be waiting to hear it.